Today we're going to be talking about a very important speech by Martin Luther King Jr. called I Have a Dream. It was a very important speech at the time in America because Black people were being treated very differently from everyone else. So it showed how they're being treated differently and it asked for change. I will read the text, and after I read the text all the way through, every paragraph, I will offer explanations on what certain things might be difficult to understand. And then after I talk about things that might be difficult to understand, I will recap it, which means I will say the entire paragraph, but in simpler words. So first off, let's start with a description of who Martin Luther King Jr. is. So it says, Martin Luther King Jr., a Baptist minister by training, a civil rights activist early in his career, leading the Montgomery bus boycott and helping to found the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Influenced by Gandhi, his philosophy of nonviolent resistance brought him worldwide attention. In 1964, King became the youngest person to receive the Nobel Prize for his efforts to end segregation and racial discrimination through civil disobedience and other nonviolent ways. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. King's important works include Strength to Love, Stride Towards Freedom, The Montgomery Story, Why We Can't Wait, and Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community. I Have a Dream is a speech he delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on August 28, 1963. Here he speaks about his dream of seeing Alabama as a developed state, free of racial distinction between whites and blacks. The speech had a huge impact in raising public consciousness for civil rights movements and in establishing King as one of the greatest orators in American history. So first off, it says that Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister. So Baptists are people who believe in Christian religion and believe that people who believe that should be baptized, which means they're usually put underwater because they believe that going underwater in that way washes away their sins, at least in a symbolic way. So their sins meaning the bad things they've done. So they believe that once you put someone underwater in that way, you wash away all the bad things that they've done in the past and they become like a new person. A minister is someone who preaches this. So Martin Luther King Jr. was someone who talked about and was for the Baptist religion. A civil rights activist is something a little more complicated. Civil rights is the idea that everyone deserves to be equal under the law, no matter what race, what religion, or other differences that they have. So this means that they want everyone to be the same. An activist is someone who is taking action to change things in the world that they believe are wrong or outdated. So for Martin Luther King Jr., he believed that the Black people were not being treated the same. They did not have the same civil rights as white people. So he was an activist trying to change that about the way America worked. A philosophy of nonviolent resistance. So many people are already familiar with this because of Gandhi, but first of all, a philosophy is a way of thinking about the world and society. And nonviolent resistance is a way of protesting without being violent. So Gandhi did this first, and Martin Luther King Jr. followed afterwards, where they wanted to protest, which means they wanted to say that they were not for this. They were against something, but they didn't want to show violence. They didn't want to hurt people, so they did it in peaceful ways. A Nobel Prize is an award given to people who have hugely, really benefited humanity. Segregation and racial discrimination. Segregation is when people are separated from other people and is usually used with the term racial discrimination, because racial discrimination means to treat people badly because of their race or to treat people differently, but usually in a negative way. So Martin Luther King Jr. Worked all his life to end segregation and racial discrimination. He did not want people to be separated from each other, Black people and white people. He wanted them to work together, and he didn't want people to be racially discriminated against, which means that he didn't want people to be treating people badly because of their race. Civil disobedience is a kind of non-violent resistance, like we just talked about, ways of resisting or protesting without being violent, where people refuse to obey certain laws so that they can protest without being violent. Orators is someone who speaks in public, usually one who makes speeches or gives lectures. So just to recap that, Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister, a civil rights activist, someone who really wanted people to be equal and the same, especially Black people, because Black people did not have the same rights at the time. But he fought for that all his life. And it talks about here all the books he wrote and the speeches he did, but I Have a Dream is by far his most famous speech. So we'll be going to that right now. So again, I will be reading the paragraph, and then I will be explaining, just like I just did, things that seem a little more difficult to understand, and then I will be giving a recap, which is like an overview of the paragraph, but I'll say it simply so that you can understand a little better. So, paragraph 1. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of captivity. Okay, so let's start with the first word that comes that's a little different from what we usually say. Score. Score means 20. So when you say 50 years ago, you mean he's saying 100 years ago. And here he talks about a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand. So this American he's talking about is Abraham Lincoln, who was a president of the United States back 100 years ago, who freed the slaves of America at the time. So when he says in whose symbolic shadow we stand, it's because this speech was given at the Lincoln Memorial, which is the place where Abraham Lincoln, that president who I just talked about, his statue is raised up there. And so when Martin Luther King gave the speech, Abraham Lincoln's statue was behind him. So that's why he's saying in this great American shadow, because he means we're in Abraham Lincoln's shadow. But he talks about the Emancipation Proclamation. So the Emancipation Proclamation is an order that was given by President Abraham Lincoln that said that all slaves should be set free. Because before that, Black people were used as slaves and they had no rights at all. But Abraham Lincoln said that that was wrong and that all slaves should be set free. Momentous is another word that comes in this paragraph. Momentous means a very important. So he was saying that this order, this Emancipation Proclamation, was very important. He also says Negro. Negro is a historic term to refer to people of African descent, so people who used to come from Africa. Withering injustice. Withering means, in this case, to make someone feel humiliated or shamed. For example, if your mom was to give you a withering look, that means that she is trying to make you feel humiliated or shamed for something you've done. So withering injustice just means a lack of justice that was made to humiliate. 100 years ago, the Emancipation Proclamation was ordered and was a very important, amazing thing for all Black people who had been slaves for so long. Paragraph 2. But 100 years later, we must face the tragic fact that the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languishing in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. So we have come here today to dramatize an appalling condition. Manacles are a metal band that chains someone's hand or ankle. So you'll see it sometimes as a metal band around someone's ankle or their hand or their wrist, where you have a chain next to it. So when he says the manacles of segregation, we talked about segregation earlier, where it's when you separate people. So he's saying that this segregation was like a manacle because it chained people to be a certain way, and they couldn't do all the things that they wanted to do. So it kept them that way. Material prosperity. Material things are things you can touch and own, like a house or money. Prosperity is being rich. So if someone has material prosperity, they're rich in things they own. Languishing. Languishing is when you aren't making progress anymore. exile. Exile is when someone is not allowed to be somewhere. So, for instance, if I visited India and then they told me I couldn't go there anymore, I would be exiled from India. I would be unexiled in India because I would just not be allowed to be there anymore. Dramatize. Dramatize means to make something like an experience into some kind of art, like a novel. So if I ate breakfast this morning and I want to dramatize it, I could write a poem about my breakfast. He's saying that even though the Emancipation Proclamation was ordered, Black people are still being discriminated against. Which, if you remember, discrimination means to treat someone badly because they're different from you. So because they're still being treated badly, he is writing about it. He's dramatizing it. Paragraph 3. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, which is comeback market insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of the nation. So we have come to cash this check. A check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. First of all, promissory note. Promissory note is when someone writes a promise to pay a certain amount of money. So this is also called a check. When you have a piece of paper or something that you can write on, and you write, I am going to give this person this amount of money. So he talks about America giving her citizens, the people who live in America, a promissory note. So obviously here, he's not actually talking about money, not actually talking about a promissory note or check. It's symbolic. And what I mean by that is he's saying that America promised her citizens freedom. So it was basically like they wrote down, I will give you freedom. And that's what he's saying here. That's why he's using the term promissory note or check. And when he says citizens of color, he means people who are not white. So he says that they were supposed to honor this sacred obligation. Sacred means holy. Obligation means something you have to do. So to say someone has a sacred obligation means that someone has something they have to do that's so important that it is almost holy. He talks about how America has given Negro people a bad check, which is comeback market insufficient funds. So if you remember, we were just talking about a promissory note, also called a check. So he's saying that America has given Negro people this check that says, like, we will give you freedom, but that when the Negroes tried to cash it in, which means they tried to say, hey, I want this now, I want my freedom, it came back insufficient funds, which means if you were doing it as a check or a promissory note, if you wanted the money and you said, hey, I want my money now, it means the person on the other side in the bank said, oh, sorry, we don't have enough money for you. So in this case, he's saying that America said, we will give you freedom. And when the Negroes tried to get that freedom, America told them, oh, sorry, actually, we don't have enough freedom for you. So hallowed is another word that's said here. Hallowed means to be made holy. And he also talks about the urgency of now. So urgency means, importance. And so he's saying here that he wants to remind America about the urgency of now, the importance of now. So not doing things later, but the importance of doing things now. And he also says, this is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling or take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. This one's a little more difficult, but basically he's still saying the same thing, that we can't take time and do things slowly. We have to do things now. So I'll explain this a little bit though. So luxury is doing something that you usually take time to enjoy, something that takes time, but that you're saying to yourself, okay, I want to do this, so I'm just going to go slow and enjoy it. Kind of like taking a bath. You don't need to take a bath. You could quickly wash yourself and not worry about it. But if you want to enjoy your time, you might sit in a bath and just enjoy the warm or cold water, and just kind of enjoy it a little bit. So that's a luxury because you're taking the time to enjoy it. So when he says luxury of cooling, cooling means obviously to make things not hot, to make things cool. So he's saying they have no time to go slow and wait for things to cool. Like they have to do it now, even though it's hot. And when he talks about tranquilizing, tranquilizing means to make something calm. And gradualism means something that happens slowly. So the tranquilizing drug of gradualism is the calm and easy desire to take things slow. So he's saying we can't have the luxury of cooling or the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. He's saying we can't have that because those things are things that take it slow. We have to act now. So he also says desolate, which means to be empty, usually of people, but in this case he just says that the valley of segregation. So the way that Black people are living because of segregation, it's an empty place because they have no rights, they have nothing they can do there, it's just empty. He's saying that America promised Black slaves freedom but didn't actually give them freedom because Black people are still not equal to white people. There were a lot of things happening at the time that separated Black people from white people, like Black people not being allowed to sit in certain places like the bus, or how Black people weren't allowed to swim with white people or marry white people. So he is saying they have to fight for their civil rights, which is, if you remember, the idea that everyone should be equal under the law. And he says that Black people can't wait to be free, that they have to work for their freedom now. Paragraph 4. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment and to underestimate the determination of the Negro. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. Negro is grated his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. Sweltering means very, very hot. So he's talking about a sweltering summer of the Negro's discontent. Legitimate discontent, legitimate, which means actual or legal, something that is according to the rules or that is real. Discontent means to not be happy with the way the things are. And then he talks about an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. So invigorating means to make someone feel strong and full of energy. So he's saying, he's using summer and autumn to talk about like times that follow after another. So summer comes first, autumn comes later. So he's saying that this time where the Negro is discontent and very not happy with the way things are, won't go away until the next time, the autumn of freedom and equality, when they become free. Until that happens, this will not go away. He also talks about a rude awakening. A rude awakening means to make someone realize something suddenly, kind of like being woken up really rudely. So like say if you were sleeping and all of a sudden somebody came over and started shaking you really hard, that would be kind of like a rude awakening. It would make you suddenly realize, oh, I need to wake up. He also says grated, which means to be made small. So he talks about Negro is graded his citizenship rights, which means that they are only given small amounts of their citizenship rights, not all of them. He's saying in this paragraph not to underestimate Black people, which to underestimate means to make something smaller or less important than it is. He is saying that Black people won't just sit by and do nothing, but that they will fight for their rights. Paragraph 5. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. Threshold is something that you have to cross over to enter somewhere, like the wood at the bottom of a door. So when you go through a door, there's usually a little bit of wood there, and you have to cross over it to get to the next room. That is a threshold. So here, when he says the threshold which leads into the palace of justice, he's saying that justice and freedom is like a big palace, a castle, and that to get through it, they have to go through a threshold. They have to go over a threshold, sorry. He's telling Black people that even though they are so close to freedom, they have to be careful not to do things that are wrong in order to become free. So here he's talking about nonviolent resistance because, to be violent would be to be wrong because you are hurting people. So he's saying that even though we are so close, we are at the threshold of justice, of freedom. We're almost there. We cannot be violent. We cannot hurt people because that's wrong. Paragraph 6. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to distrust all white people. For many of our white people, for many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny, and their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. So first of all, he talks about a plane, a high plane of dignity and discipline. A plane is either an airplane that you use to travel, or it can also be used to mean a way of thinking. So here he talks about a way of thinking of dignity and discipline. Dignity is a state of being worthy of honor, of feeling pride or respect for yourself, and discipline is a way of training people to obey the rules. But he says that we cannot allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Degenerate means to become less. So he's saying that we have a great cause here, a great protest. It's very creative and it's for us, it's for the good. But we cannot allow it to become less just because we want to do physical violence. And he talks about meeting physical force with soul force. So he just means by this resisting the urge to be violent and instead fight with things that come from the soul, like words or ways of living. He talks about militancy, which militancy is using violence to make change. And engulfed. Engulfed means to be covered by something completely. He also says inextricably, which means that in a way that you cannot separate or entangle yourself. White people and Black people are inextricably bound so that they cannot be separated from each other because white people's freedom and Black people's freedom go hand in hand. So if you separate them, then neither of them can have true freedom. So he's saying that we have to work together to get this. So here he's saying that white people are not the enemy because a lot of white people are trying to help Black people be free. So Black people shouldn't think that violence against white people is what's going to make them free. He's saying they have to always try to do things peacefully and together. 7. And as we walk, we make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. A pledge is a promise. Devotees are people who have given a lot of their time and energy to something. Fatigue is tiredness and exhaustion. Mobility is the ability to be able to move freely and easily. And a ghetto is a part of a city that's poorer than the rest of the city. He is saying that they cannot give up until they have equality and freedom. He brings into, as an example, people not being able to go to certain hotels or certain motels, or not being able to move from a place they want to go. They have to go from a ghetto to another ghetto. So like a poor place to another poor place. So he's saying until they have freedom, until they have absolute equality, they cannot give up. Paragraph 8. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulation. Some of you have come fresh from narrow cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. So he talks about persecution, which is when people are treated badly because of the things they believe in. And he talks about police brutality, which is when police use the power that they have to hurt people. He also talks about redemption, being redemptive. Redemptive means to be able to redeem someone, which means to save them from mistakes or evil. He is saying that he understands that many Black people have had very difficult things happen in their lives, like being in prison or being, subject to police brutality. But that he wants them to understand that unearned suffering is redemptive. In the Christian religion, it is believed that Jesus Christ, the Son of the Christian God, lived a life of suffering on earth and died a death of suffering, so that all people who believed in him wouldn't have to suffer for all the bad things that they've done. So that redeemed, saved him and others. So he's saying that suffering, even though it is unearned, and by that he means even though the people who are suffering right now, like the Black people, shouldn't be suffering, that suffering can be used for good. Paragraph 9. Go back to Mississippi, go back to Alabama, go back to Georgia, go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. So Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, these are all states, places in America that a lot of Black people lived in. And slums are much like ghettos that we talked about in the last paragraph, parts of the city that are poorer than the rest of the city. And to wallow means to kind of stay and not try to move in something. He's saying, go back home and not worry, because things are going to be different. Paragraph 10. I say to you today, my friends, that in spite of the difficulties and frustrations of the moment, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. So the American dream is this idea that everyone has the same opportunity as every other American. So in America, everyone is equal. And if everyone has the same kind of opportunities, then anything can be accomplished. Any dream you have, you can make come true. He's saying that despite all the bad things that have happened, he has a dream for Black people that comes from the American dream. He wants the same thing that people say is the American dream to not just be for white people, but to be possible also for Black people. Paragraph 11. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Self-evident means something that doesn't need to be explained, something that's obvious. But this one line here, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, is something that's written in the Declaration of Independence, which was something written by the United States at the time to explain to the world why they wanted to become a country. So we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal means it's obvious. We're all equal. We are all created the same. And he's saying that he has a dream that one day Americans will not just say that, but will actually be that way for everyone, including Black people. Paragraph 12. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. Paragraph 13. I have a dream that one day even the state of Mississippi, a desert state, sweltering with the heat of injustice and oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. An oasis is a spot in a desert, so a very, very dry place where water can be found. Paragraph 14. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Paragraph 15. I have a dream today. Paragraph 16. I have a dream that one day the state of Alabama, whose governor's lips are presently dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, will be transformed into a situation where little Black boys and Black girls will be able to join hands with the little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers. Interposition is when a place in America, a state, can tell the government, no, what you're doing to my people is wrong, and can stand in the way between the government and the people it is trying to make follow that law, so it can stop that law from happening. And the way it stops that law from happening is by nullification. So nullification is getting rid of a law because it becomes clear that that law is wrong. So he's saying in this paragraph that there's a governor in Alabama, which is a place in America, who is saying, what you're doing to Black people is wrong, and I want to nullify this law. I don't want this law to be around anymore because it is wrong. Paragraph 17. I have a dream today. Paragraph 18. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. So exalted means to be placed higher up or be made more powerful. Paragraph 19. This is our hope. This is the faith with which I return to the South. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jingling chords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. To hew means to chop or cut something. Discords means in music when notes don't go together, and symphony means when all the notes go together well and make a big, beautiful song. Paragraph 20. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with a new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. So a pilgrim is people who moved from the United Kingdom to America and settled there. This song that he sings, My Country 'Tis of Thee, Sweet Land of Liberty, all the way up to Let Freedom Ring, that little area of text, this is an American patriotic song, meaning that it was a song written to inspire love for America. So he's saying that once everyone is equal and has the same civil rights, they will be able to actually believe the song when it says, let freedom ring, because everyone will then have freedom. And if America is to be a great nation, this must come true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous peaks of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from the Stone Mountains of Georgia. Let freedom ring from the Lookout Mountains of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and every molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. So in those past few paragraphs, he is naming all these mountains in America and saying that people will be yelling from the mountains that freedom is here. Paragraph 27. When we let freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So as a small explanation before I go into a final recap, a hamlet is like a small village, and Jews, Gentiles, Protestants, and Catholics are different groups of people who believe different things. A spiritual is a religious kind of song that Black people used to sing. So here he's saying again that, when all people are equal, we will be able to join hands and sing these kinds of songs that say that freedom is here. So as a final recap, what this speech is Martin Luther King Jr. saying, hey, we're not free. We don't have the same rights as everyone else, and everyone needs to notice this, and we need to make a change about it. We need to make this different. But he's saying we don't want to do it in a way that's violent. We don't want to hurt anybody. We want to do it in a way that people will just look at us and see that something is wrong and something needs to be changed. So this was very important because at the time, if people were resisting, they were doing it in ways that were violent. So people were getting a lot of persecution for that. So with the way Martin Luther King Jr. is saying it here, he's saying, let's not be violent. Let's not hurt people, but we want to change. We want to be better. We want people to look at us the same way they look at other people, and we want to be free. And he's saying that one day this is going to happen for us. One day we will be free. One day we are going to get everything that we've asked for. So this is a very important speech in American history because of this, for one, Martin Luther King Jr. became known as a very famous person and people were able to follow him and follow his teachings. For two, because it called attention to the fact that there was something wrong, where before people just kind of let it cruise by and didn't really pay attention to it. But now they realize something is wrong and we need to change this. And so this brought about a great change in American society.